Meeting is being recorded.
Welcome, everyone. I will kick us off once we hit 1:15, but thank you so much for joining us. All right. Thanks again for everyone joining us. This is the session Making Justice Work for You, Informal Resolution Goal Setting and Managing Expectations with our wonderful presenters, Ellie, Olivia, and Anna. My name is Natalie, and I will be your chat support. As a reminder, this session is being recorded, and all recordings from this conference will be available to you on the Whova app for up to 3 months. As you watch this session, we ask that you please use the Whova engagement features. You'll see them to the right-hand side of your screen. They are white. Please use the chat and Q&A tabs. And our presenters will be monitoring that and answering questions as they come out throughout our time together today. All participants are muted and cannot unmute. You can also select live transcription is available for live audio captioning and the full transcript of this session. Please also notice the take notes feature under the session title. You can store your notes and ideas from this session in that space. Your notes are only yours and will not appear for anyone else attending. When the session is over, please remember to go to the conference evaluation. I will put the link in the chat and provide feedback on how the session went. And if you are applying for CEs, you must complete the evaluations. And with that, we are ready to begin.
Thank you. Anna, if you want to head to the next slide. So first, we're going to introduce our team. My name is Olivia Darrow-Wallace. I am the Assistant Director for Advocacy Services at Vanderbilt University's Project Safe Center for Sexual Misconduct Prevention and Response. I have been in the field of victim advocacy for the last 10 years, and I've been in doing campus victim advocacy for the last 5 years when I joined the team at Project Safe. Maybe Anna's having the same issue with not being able to unmute again.
Okay, is it working now? Great. Thanks. My name's Anna. I'm one of our victim resource specialists at Project Safe. I've worked at Vanderbilt University for almost 4 years. Did that work?
I can hear you, but there's an echo.
Yeah. This one better?
In the chat, could people say if they heard Anna?
Sorry, I'm having audio issues.
It seems to be a little bit better. Anna, keep talking for just a second.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, it's still echoing. Let me just look and see where we're getting audio for you from.
Okay, I can try to keep talking, see if the echo. I don't know why it's echoing.
Okay, just real quick. Sorry,
Yeah.
everybody. Anna, Do you have the audio enabled in Whova or only on Zoom?
I did not enable it on Hoover.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure why we have a little bit of an echo. It's not too terrible, but
Here, let me try. Is this better? No.
yes, perfect.
Okay. Okay, great.
Okay, if you're saying anything, we can't hear you.
I don't know where my video went now, but but you can hear me, right? Hopefully.
Yes, we
Okay.
can.
Okay.
The echo isn't too bad if, at least that's kind of the consensus in the chat.
Okay. Well, there we go. Is that better all around? Okay, cool. Don't know what that was. Thanks. Do I need to do my introduction again? Or did everyone hear my introduction with the echo?
You can do it again.
Okay. My name's Autumn Mims. I use she, her pronouns. I'm one of our victim resource specialists at Project Safe. I've been working here for about 4 years. Happy to be here today.
Hi, everyone. My name's Ellie Boating. I use she, her pronouns. I am also a victim resource specialist at Project Safe. I started in this role last January. Prior to that, I was working at the University of Texas at Austin in the Title IX office. And prior to that, got my Master's of Public Policy and Education Policy here at Vanderbilt. So we're really excited to have you all today and to get to talk about this topic with you. So as I just said, we are the advocacy team at Project Safe. Project Safe is an office on campus here at Vanderbilt University, which is located in Nashville, Tennessee. So just kind of a broad overview of Project Safe. Students can access our services anonymously or confidentially on campus. We also serve faculty, staff, and postdocs as well. We have a 24/7 hotline that is staffed by advocates. So if you were to call the hotline right now, it'd be one of our staff members. We do a lot of different things in our roles as advocates. We do a lot of accompaniment, so to order of protection court or to appointments with police or on-campus appointments with faculty members or accompaniment to Title IX meetings, things like that. We also do academic accommodations, safety planning, and referral to resources off campus. So, for example, if somebody wanted to see a counselor at the sexual assault center, we can make that we can facilitate that accommodation here. And another part of our office is education. We do a lot of different trainings to, work on that kind of prevention education side of things, consent, supporting a survivor, assertiveness training, all of that sort of stuff, as well as the typical kind of awareness month events and partnering with student organizations and offices on campus for more personalized training and education. So what we're going to cover today is just informal resolution basics, the framework for IR asks, managing expectations and what that looks like, restorative justice kind of as an overview, and then kind of comparing restorative justice and informal resolution, as well as a fun coaching activity that we'll get to do at the end. Okay, let's get into it. So I really like to start when we're talking about any sort of policy, kind of at the broad view, so we're all on the same page. I think it's really good to kind of look at that like top-down approach to Title IX policy. It's really important to remember that Title IX has been through lots of different iterations and different political administrations. Informal resolution was codified in the 2020 regulation, so this is a super new policy as far as policies go. So it's kind of natural that there's going to be kinks or growing pains as we kind of figure out how this actually applies to real human beings. It's important to note that the policy language here is left intentionally vague, so it gives universities a lot of freedom to decide what their informal resolution process could look like. So that's really cool because it means we could go above and beyond compliance. We always love when that happens, right? It really gives universities the ability to create more trauma-informed practices or to make sure our practices aren't interfering with, what it means to be a student at an institution and how to, still get their educational opportunities and on-campus opportunities while going through a process like this one. So, going above and beyond compliance is awesome, and we always hope that that's what the institutions are doing. A few things I'd like to note from the policy. This last sentence here, any person who facilitates an informal resolution must be well trained. And that begs the question, what the heck does well trained mean, right? And they didn't say what that means. So you're like, is that a lawyer? Is that a person with a certificate? Is that, Joe Schmo with a BA in psychology? Like, what does it mean to be well trained? A lot of schools have taken it to mean a lawyer or a certified mediator. And a lot of times that's kind of when we're seeing this sort of trend towards more like lawyers in Title IX and more people who with legal experience working in Title IX because of policies like this one. Another thing that's important to note in the second part here, it says that parties can't be required to participate in IR. That's going to be modeled in the Vanderbilt policy that we'll talk about next. And then also parties can withdraw and go back to the formal process. This is really important because it gives folks the opportunity to, think through their options and then can, withdraw at any time and go back to the original process. And then kind of zooming down, kind of narrowing the scope to Vanderbilt specifically. I'm very nosy and like to know what other institutions' policies are and like what their practices look like. So I think that maybe that's just interesting to me as a policy nerd. I think our policy is really similar to other peer institutions. But a few things that I always like to note is that the Title IX coordinator determines if the case even qualifies for informal resolution or IR. There's a couple of different key reasons why it would not qualify, and a really big one, the one that we see come up most often, is when there's some sort of power differential. So if the complainant is a student and the respondent is a faculty member, it would not qualify for informal resolution because of that power differential. Another important thing to note about Vanderbilt specifically is that our Title IX staff do facilitate the process, and they do that like mediation back and forth. Additionally, either party can request informal resolution. We've seen a really big trend, and I think this is probably true for all institutions, and I would love for you all to let me know if this is true at your institution, where respondents are requesting informal resolution and complainants are not interested, which kind of makes logical sense, right? Like I think a lot of respondents think they could get a lower sanction if they are willing to participate in informal resolution. And as the respondent, obviously you would want to, mitigate as many consequences as possible, just so, you aren't in trouble with the institution or have some sort of disciplinary outcome when it comes to, the determination of a formal complaint. And then just to kind of look at it in a more practical sense, I think it's interesting to go through what Title IX looks like here, the advocate's role, and the informal resolution conference day itself. So with Title IX as an advocate, an individual could come to us at pretty much any time in the process. Maybe they'll come to us before they file a formal complaint. Maybe it's after. Maybe it's when they decide that they want to do informal resolution and they find out about our services. They can kind of come to us at any point, and there's no right or wrong way to access those services. But it does help when we have a little bit more context before going into the actual conference itself, obviously. Also, supportive measures. We can really act as kind of the go-between or the advocate for certain measures that Title IX can help the student to obtain. So the really big ones that we think about here are like class changes, housing reassignments, or no contact directives. Those are kind of three of the big ones that we see a lot. And then also And the advocate role, a big part that Olivia is going to talk about is managing expectations. That's obviously huge. And then also being able to facilitate those other supportive measures. So, with or without Title IX, we can, get students connected to things like counseling or academic coaching if this is impacting their academics. Or like I mentioned before, like a referral to an off-campus resource that's maybe a little bit more specialized than what our counseling center may be able to provide long term. So, like the Sexual Assault Center in Nashville is a really good example of that. And then finally, when we get to the informal resolution conference day itself, some things that we always like to think about when we're hosting a student for an informal resolution conference. I should mention they're typically on Zoom, so they typically come to us and then we're able to kind of support them in that way. So some big stuff that we like to think about is creating a comfortable environment. And that looks different for everyone. Like what would make me comfortable may not be what makes Olivia or Anna comfortable. But we like to have a big basket of fidgets. We all have Squishmallows in our office. That's like our big thing. We also like to have snacks and drinks, as well as sound machines, so that they have, feel like they're in kind of a private space. Thinking about things like lamps versus overhead lights, like white light versus yellow light, all of those kind of things are different elements that could just help someone feel safer in the space. It's probably going to be a long day. Some informal resolution conferences are really quick and over in a flash, whereas other ones can take a couple hours. And so we want to make sure that that person has everything they need to feel comfortable in that space, and just to, be able to kind of settle in. As well as helping that person to like notice cues and take breaks when they're feeling anxious or overwhelmed. This is really, really important and kind of seems like, duh, of course, I'll let them take breaks or whatever. But this is a really important role and can, help the student or individual who's going through this process a lot, because inherently, when we're working with Title IX, there's a power dynamic. And so when someone's meeting with Title IX, being able to help remind them that this is their process, they have agency, and they get to determine how it proceeds. This can really help a lot with limiting re-traumatization as well. Obviously, we can't make any like guarantees about how this process is going to go for them, but as much as we can do to kind of create that, barrier between them and the process and help them to feel comfortable is really important. And I think it is really an important trauma-informed practice that we can create and kind of have built into our system here at Vanderbilt.
Thanks, Ellie. So yeah, zooming into that, we're getting ready for the informal resolution conference. As Ellie said, those happen on Zoom here. And what we do is we invite the student to come to our office and take part in the Zoom here with us. And that's so that they don't have to be in bed, going through this back and forth. No one really wants to have to do that in their own space. It also can help us to keep the student grounded, as there is a lot of breaks in informal resolution, at least in the way that it's done here at Vanderbilt. So rather than the student being put into a Zoom room and they're alone and they've got plenty of time to spiral, we want to be there with them to help address that anxiety. The Zoom, it is really just a shuttle mediation. So our Title IX office, which we are separate from, we are totally separate offices, they have an informal resolutions manager position. So that is the person who's going to be going back and forth between the Zoom rooms, where we're there with the student and then the respondent is presumably with their advisor in the other Zoom room. There's never interactions. It's only that informal resolution manager going back and forth and communicating the asks and the responses to those. So as we have walked through this process with different students, we have noticed a theme of some different goals that kind of tend to come up with what people are looking for out of this process. And it's really about looking at, what have students asked for in the past, and then what's underneath that ask. And oftentimes what we have found underneath the ask to be is a goal of justice, education, and/or safety. Those are the big ones that really it can be boiled down to. And having this framework is a really helpful way to assist a student in figuring out what it is they want to ask for. because it can be really daunting to just be told, okay, we're going to have this meeting and you're going to get to come up with an ask of anything that you want. Okay, what do you want? That's a hard question to answer right off the bat. So if we can help students to form their asks based off of these different goals, it really gives them somewhere to start. It can help them to feel not so much pressure of, okay, I just on my own have to come up with a list of things that I'm going to be happy with and that are realistic and that the other person would agree to. I just have to figure that out. So we use this framework instead to help guide those discussions and help students come up with a custom list of the things that they need out of the process. So the first one, justice. The question I always start any conversation with a student about informal resolution is, what does justice feel like to you? There's some big connotations that come with that word. A lot of time the word justice we associate with the criminal legal system, when it can have a much more broad meaning than just that, especially in an informal resolution setting where we aren't pursuing things like expulsion, where there aren't going to be those punitive types of sanctions. So if we can expand the idea of justice and get people comfortable thinking of alternative paths to that, it really opens things up as they're thinking through, what do I want to ask for in this process? And there's not really a wrong answer to that. Now, if the only answer to that is that they're expelled, then we might need to have a conversation of if informal resolution is the right process to pursue, right? Like if they are only wanting that one meaning of justice, then this might not be the process for it. But there really is not a wrong answer to that question. So for some people, it might be that I just want them to understand how they harmed me. I want them to have to listen to me talk or, what I've written about how I've been impacted here. That would feel like justice if they could understand how I've been impacted. For other people, it's, I want to make sure this never happens again. And so if we can start there with like, what do you need out of this? That really will guide the rest of the conversation. Education is our next big framework goal. Some guiding questions there are, what is important for them to understand about their behavior? So this is very dependent on the situation. And what's great about IR is that it isn't one size fits all. It can be really, really customized to what the student is needing, what they're looking for, and whatever happened that led to being in the process to start with. So what's important for them to understand about their behavior? Maybe it's that they need a better understanding of just what consent is. They need a better understanding of how their behavior impacts others. They need a better understanding of what it is to be considerate of other people, whatever that might be. Also, what's the best way for them to receive this information? Oh, if you could go back, Anna. What's the best way for them to receive this information? So does that mean asking them to read a book and write a paper about it? We have had students do that. Is that taking a one-on-one class? Is that doing something, an online course? So really thinking through, if we want this person to learn from this process, what's the best way that we can do that? And also customizing it that way. If some people know that like, no, I want them to have to sit in a room across from a human and sit kind of in that discomfort of that learning environment about this is what consent is, or I don't think that they would really take anything seriously unless they're hearing it from a man. Okay, well then we can arrange that for this education to come from the right person to be telling them about their behavior and basically what went wrong and where they needed to adjust in the past. And then the last one, safety. This one can be difficult because that is a really subjective thing of feeling safe, being safe. I think those are two different things. Also, physical safety, emotional safety, mental safety. What is it that we're pursuing here? But starting with the question of, what do you need to feel safe on this campus? Sometimes the answer to that is very personal towards them. I need them to no longer be able to talk to me. Sometimes it's more about the community. I need them to not have access to such and such because I'm worried about this happening to other people in the future. So we're thinking of safety for that person as well as for the community as a whole. And with all of those goals in mind, here are some of our very common asks that we see people want to pursue. So an agreement to have no contact going forward is typical of all of the informal resolution processes that we've done. Typically, there is a no contact directive in place before the informal resolution conference. And so usually number one is we're going to keep that in place. We're going to both agree that the no contact directive will stay in place and we will adhere to it throughout our time at the university. So that one, and that's just one that I think is a good one, just kind of as a blanket, like, yep, we're going to start with this. It also can help to have something to give the student to like kick things off, you know? So you have the goals and you're going through those questions, but if they're still kind of having a hard time, this one is a really easy ask to suggest to help them kind of, okay, and then what can I add to the list? So what if we started with just asking for the no contact directive to stay in place? Does that feel like a good place to start? And then building that confidence as they think through other things that they might be looking for. Another super common one that we have is students wanting to have some sort of victim impact statement, whether that is written, whether they record it and the person has to listen to that audio recording. Sometimes it's writing a letter about, hey, this is how I have been impacted and I need you to understand it. This could be a poem. This could be a work of art that the person has created. This could really be anything to show how that person has been impacted. Sometimes students want a response in a way. And sometimes that's out of I just want to make sure that I want to know that they actually listen to it. You know, I don't want to just send this audio file to the informal resolution manager. He's going to send it to the other party. And then I hope that they listen to it. I want some sort of confirmation that they heard what I had to say. So sometimes this ask comes along with, and you'll go to the Title IX office and sit with Matthew, that's who the informal resolutions manager is, and you'll sit with Matthew and you'll listen to that victim impact statement. Sometimes it's, I want them to have to write a response. And sometimes the student wants to read that response and sometimes they don't. You know, they don't have to be one and the same. So things we've done in the past is that the other party would write a response to the victim impact statement. And then Matthew would be the one to kind of read that and determine if, okay, yes, this shows that they did listen and they did reflect, like, okay, I'm checking off on this, and the complainant might not ever see it. Sometimes the complainant might want an actual, like, no, I want them to respond to me in some way, telling me how they understand that I've been impacted. So all of these are options, and it's important to specify that, especially if you're doing the no contact directive ask, because we don't want anyone to be unable to respond because of that no contact directive. So, you know, that could be specifically written as an exception to the no contact directive, that so-and-so can write a letter back about this. Educational conversations are a huge one, and that's one that I think students a lot of times don't realize that it is something they can ask for. Here at Vanderbilt, we are able to use our office to do those educational conversations. So our director, Kara, and our assistant director for prevention, Otis, they have several times a semester appointments with respondents to talk about boundaries, consent, consent and alcohol, dating violence, you know, whatever the topic might be. Sometimes you're going to have 6 different sessions of conversations with Kara. Sometimes it's you're going to read a book and then you're going to come in and you're going to discuss that book with Otis about this. So it can really be custom, and the person can ask for what they feel is appropriate. You know, for some people, it's like, I just need someone to tell them, you know, what consent is. And other time it's like, no, I want them to have to go and to 6 different sessions of this so that to make sure that they really get it. So being able to have flexibility in how that is presented is great. If you are at an institution and you don't necessarily have a staff member who could do something like this, there's also online courses, things like that. I would definitely recommend vetting those before having a student ask for them as part of the agreement. But that's definitely another way that you can access that sort of education. Another really common one is agreeing on access to different common areas. So the no contact directive, that can be in place at Vanderbilt. That doesn't prohibit someone from being in the same space. It just prohibits intentional contact. So a way to make sure that you're not going to run into them at the rec center, or you're not going to run into them every morning when you're just trying to get breakfast, is to come up with an agreement to this. Now, this one can be a little difficult sometimes because just being realistic of like, can we really ask them to never again go to the rec center? Probably not, but we can ask them to only go on Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, and you have the rest of the week, or however it is that that works out. You know, sometimes we've had different agreements for dining halls based off of which hall has like the right allergen things, or which hall is the one that they really like this specific dish at. Okay, so it can get really specific with all of those needs and making sure that they're met. And then also just want to note that there are unrealistic asks, and this is also part of managing expectations, which we'll talk about next. But some asks that we commonly have students bring up that aren't quite as feasible are things like volunteering. This is one that a lot of students when we're having the initial conversations about, okay, we're going to come up with a list of asks. What would you like this other person to have to do? And what we hear a lot is, I want them to volunteer at a domestic violence shelter. Now, I think we all can see how that is well-intentioned, you know, of wanting this other person to understand the impact of their actions. However, then we also have to have the conversation with the complainant about, so this is a person who has caused harm. This is a group of people who have experienced harm. We don't really want to force these people who have experienced harm to be around a person who has caused that type of harm in hopes of the person who has caused harm learning something, right? Like that's just not something that we ever really want to send someone off to a domestic violence shelter or a rape crisis center for the sake of their learning, when that also impacts all the people who are seeking services there. So that's a conversation that we do have a lot, and students really understand once we frame it that way. I've never had a student like hung up on that or push back on that. It really is kind of just a like, oh yeah, right, okay, didn't think of that. So that's a conversation that we have often. A lot of times people want an apology, and I can completely understand that desire. Part of the conversation we have to have, though, is, do we think this person is going to be willing to apologize or not, right? Because anything they put in writing could potentially be used against them in the future. Even if the complainant is like, I promise up and down, I am not going to try to sue them, I'm not going to try to press charges against them, anything. The other party probably isn't going to just take their word for it and be willing to spell out all of the ways in which they caused harm and address it and acknowledge it. So that's something that we can ask for, but we've got to understand it might not be a super realistic thing that they're going to agree to. Another one being therapy. So we have a lot of students ask for a respondent to have to go to therapy, and that is something we can ask for. However, we can't really mandate what someone talks about in therapy. That is confidential. It is protected by HIPAA. We're not going to get a report back after the therapy session about if they talked about the right things or not. That's something we can't control. So yes, we can ask for them to have to go to therapy about this, but we have no guarantee that they will do any work around it, that they will acknowledge their part in it or anything. So helping complainants understand that if they are wanting to pursue that goal of justice and safety, that therapy isn't necessarily an automatic for that. Another one that I've had students try to ask for is money. That is one that is just not really an option, because you're not negotiating in good faith if there's money involved, and there's nothing that would prevent the person from later on saying, no, I didn't actually do any of that. They wanted money, so I agreed to it. So you can't really negotiate in good faith and have that be one of the asks. So that is one that is prohibited. And then I already talked about this a little bit too, but if the person is seeking for the respondent to be separated from the university, whether that's a suspension, an expulsion. The other party probably isn't going to agree to that. The reason that they wanted to do IR is probably to avoid that very thing. So if that is what their goal is they are looking for that person to face separation from the university, then the formal grievance protocol is how that could potentially happen. So then the negotiating and managing expectations piece of it. So we always say that we're gonna start big. So we are going to make a long list of all of the asks, anything that you can think of, we're gonna start there. We also make sure that the first thing that the complainant says is always, I'm not going to agree to any of your asks. And this one is really important because we have had some instances in the past that we later learn a complainant agreed to take consent education as well because it's the only way the respondent would agree to do so. And we don't want victims to have to be sitting through consent education and getting lectured about something that they don't need that education. They were harmed in this. They didn't cause that harm. And so by just starting off with the blanket, so first of all, I'm not going to be agreeing to any asks that the respondent has of me. Now, the no contact directive is an exception to that because that is mutual. But other than that, like, no, I'm not going to agree to go to therapy just because you're mad that I'm asking you to go to therapy. I'm not going to agree to 6 hours of consent education because you're upset that you're in this position, even though it was from your own actions. So you want to try to make me have to do that too. No, we're not going to do that. And then in that list, knowing what's non-negotiable and what's not is kind of the next step. So we're going to start with this big list. Now, what do we need to put a little star next to as this is an absolute? Like if I don't have this one, then it's not worth it and I'm prepared to walk away from this process. Versus, yeah, that would be nice to have, but it's okay. I don't think they're actually going to agree to it. So yeah, if they say no to that, that's okay. I'll stick with it and we can keep going through this process. Maybe it's the entire ask is non-negotiable, maybe pieces of it are, so we're going to start off by asking for 6 hours of consent education. And then it's okay if it gets negotiated down to 3, but I want at least 3. So there's some wiggle room here. Having all of that in mind ahead of time can be really helpful for the student to not feel lost in the process, to not feel overwhelmed by, okay, they said no, what do I do now? So having these conversations ahead of time, and it's okay if the student changes their mind in the moment. It's okay if the student is like, oh, I kind of want to wait and see, but just having the conversation and getting them thinking about it a little bit is really helpful. And having that line of when will it be time to walk away? Maybe I can't go back and forth with this more than 4 times. Maybe it's those specific asks. If they say, if it's an absolute no to those, then I'm fine with walking away. And understanding that walking away also means that you are now doing the formal process with an interview, with a hearing, all of that. So that's a big calculation. And I think it's important to spend some time on that conversation with students of, okay, so if we walk away now, this is what that means, and making sure that they have an understanding of that so that later they aren't feeling like, oh no, I didn't know that it was going to mean having to tell my story to yet another person when I actually 2 hours of consent education, I could have lived with that, so making sure that they really understand that. And that is the managing expectations portion. Managing expectations, if you ask my team, they will verify, I say all the time, is the hardest part of victim advocacy, I think. Because I think generally people who are drawn to this field are nice people and we want to be helpful and we want to empower people. And so then having to have the conversations of like, oh no, actually, or if someone is really hopeful about a certain process because that's what they've seen on TV, then having to be the one to kind of like, okay, wait, but that's really hard, but it is so vitally important. We cannot do this job without having a lot of conversations about managing expectations. And it's a way that we're caring for the student. So the hard conversations are important because you're showing care for them as opposed to, okay, yeah, I don't think that's going to work, but I'm not going to say a word about that. to you, and then I know that your hopes are going to be dashed. Oh no, that's not what we want to do. We want to be caring for the student in those moments. It is also difficult because it's having to balance empowering the person, the complainant, to pursue what they want, So, no, I really want to ask for therapy. So we're balancing that, what they're saying they need, and helping them understand the potential outcomes. Not because we're here to say no, not because we're here to dictate what they are or are not allowed to ask for or need, but because it's our job to help them understand what could potentially come out of that. And I am very frank in my discussions with students about that. I tell them all the time, it's not my job to tell you what to do. It is my job to help you understand the possibilities that could come along with that. And also absolutely pairing that with, and I'm here for whatever you want to do. So we are empowering and we are walking alongside them. We're just also having to balance that with hopefully them not experiencing more harm by the ways that the system doesn't work out, and that they would have no way of knowing the system doesn't work out because they're not in it every day. They're not familiar with the ins and outs of it in the way that we are. And so helping students to understand that piece of it too, of like, based off of what I've seen in the past, what our office has assisted other students with is a helpful way for them to still get what they are looking for. And I also like to end every informal resolution conference before, the agreement is signed, before we say, okay, we've arrived at an agreement, is that same question that we started with. So does this feel like justice to you? And so, okay, this was a long process. Maybe we had a lot of back and forth. It can be easy to lose sight of that initial meaning of justice, that initial goal they were pursuing. So if we can call it back to that and say, okay, we've landed at X, Y, and Z as what we're going to be doing. Does this feel like justice? Or the first time that we talked about this, you told me that you really needed for them to hear you out about how you've been harmed. In this agreement that we've come up with, there's nothing about a victim impact statement. So I just want to check in with you and make sure that this is still getting you what you need, even if it doesn't have what you initially voiced as your ask. So just checking back in about that is important. And I think along the way, but really I think that should be the question that starts and ends any informal resolution discussion, to make sure that the student is getting what it is that they are looking for. The importance of a good advisor is huge. We've had some students who weren't aware of our services, and later they come in and they have gone through an informal resolution process in the past, and they were agreeing to consent education, and well, yeah, I had to go to therapy because the other person wanted to go to, didn't want to be the only one to do so. If they have a good advisor with them during that process, then that advisor can tell them like, hey, no, this isn't about that you both have to do the same things. This is about finding resolution for what happened. And so making sure that there is an advisor who can remind them of that, no, you don't have to agree to these things. Is this what you're actually looking for? Is huge. And at least at Vanderbilt, the informal resolution manager, they're not doing that, right? They really are just the back and forth shuttle mediator communicating. They asked for this. Okay, so and so said yes to this, no to this, without any commentary. They are that third party neutral person. So they're not going to be there reminding the complainant, oh, no, you don't have to agree to consent education just because the other person is. So having a good advisor is super important. And also balancing with managing expectations, balancing the might as well ask for it versus I don't know if that's super realistic. So it's not only empowering them to pursue what they need and understanding the potential outcomes, but also balancing between, well, the answer is always no unless we ask. So yeah, might as well put it on the list. Let's see if they'll agree to read that book and write a reflection paper about it. As well as, and we know that they may not agree to that, so keeping that in mind of like, well, we might as well ask. We're not there to like just say no to all of the things that the students are looking for at all. But again, just helping them to understand the potential outcomes of those various things. And then, as Ellie mentioned, there are some situations where it is not appropriate for informal resolution to take place. So the ones that are outlined in policy are when there is a student complainant and faculty respondent, or student complainant and staff respondent, because of that power differential. And then also institutions, as Ellie mentioned, have the freedom to determine other situations where it may not be appropriate. So that could be based off the level of violence or severity. That could be, well, the Title IX office has 3 other cases in which this person is named. So at this point, we've got a lot of information about this person's behavior. Can we just say like, no, it's okay for there not to be an interview here, for there not to be an investigation here? There's some information that once the institution learns it, they can't unknow it, and something has to be done about it. So this is really dependent on the institution. So it's important to know or have an idea of some of those lines so that you aren't talking informal resolution up as this amazing thing that's going to work out for someone if the Title IX office is then going to say, sorry, this isn't a situation in which we can do informal resolution.
Okay, my turn. Everyone can hear me still? Good. Okay. I didn't touch my volume at all because I was stressed about that. So we're going to pivot a little bit and talk about restorative justice. I'll be clear up front and get into this a little bit later, but restorative justice is not informal resolution. But I think there are some helpful concepts within the practices within restorative justice that can be helpful for us to reflect on and learn about. So restorative justice is an alternative framework for addressing harm and conflict. It shifts the focus from punishment to relationships, active accountability, and healing. It's rooted in centuries-old indigenous, religious, and cultural practices. And it's an inclusive process that invites everyone affected by the harm to share how they were affected and then to explore ways to move forward together. So I have a little side by side here. So to understand it, we can kind of compare it to the punitive system of justice. So with punitive justice, we're more familiar with that in the United States. It asks what rule was broken, who did the crime, and then what punishment do they deserve, with the central assumption being punishment and fear of future punishment deters future misconduct. Restorative justice tries to shift the focus entirely to the people affected by the harm. So what happened, who was affected and how, and what do we need to move forward? So the central assumption here is that strengthening relationships and holding people accountable for repairing harm deters future misconduct. As we get started, I do want to emphasize restorative justice is most importantly survivor-centered. So 2 things are non-negotiable. The one harmed, the survivor, is never required to participate in any part of the process. It must be voluntary. And second, the survivor's role is to identify the impact of the harm and to share their needs. They are never given asks, demands, or requirements for repair or action within the process. So similar to what Olivia was saying with like trying to empower the survivors and complainants that we're working with within the process to not necessarily say yes to some things like consent education. We're not giving them, within restorative justice, they're not being given asks to repair the harm. The focus of the process is the person who caused harm taking accountability and then mending relationships through direct amends on their part. So when we get into restorative justice, just a quick overview, you can remember the key principles as the 5 R's. So relationships are the foundation, and the focus is repairing a ruptured relationship caused by a harmful act. Second is respect. So everyone must maintain mutual respect throughout the process. This is a big part of ensuring a safe environment for dialogue. I'll get into some examples of like what some restorative practices are, and you'll see that that's like a really important piece of the practice. Responsibility. So the person who caused harm must take accountability and be willing to explain the harm and its impact. Repair. Following responsibility, now we move to action. So the person works to make things as right as possible. That doesn't mean it's erasing or like moving past without any kind of accountability. That's a big part of like responsibility going hand in hand with that. It's earning trust back. And that reintegration piece, after you take responsibility and complete repair, the person who caused the harm hopefully can be supported in returning to the community. And a big piece of that is like, what are the direct amends? What were the educational pieces? And a big part of the restorative framework is community decides how to move forward together. So you're not just going to immediately trust someone who caused harm to like jump back in and not cause that harm again. You're going to want to see like actionable moves that they're making to like amend those relationships, and not cause that harm again to someone else or to the same individual. So restorative justice isn't just one practice, it's a continuum of tools used to shift culture. So there's an 80-20 rule. 80% of efforts are proactive, community building work done every day to help prevent harm and build relational strength. So this is going to cover both the informal and preventative practices you see on the screen and the mid-level practices that address minor conflicts or lower level harm. So informal practices are daily tools to build relationships, and to set cultural norms. So think effective statements, so expressing how actions impact us, and restorative questions, so encouraging reflection on the impact that was caused. So this is something that you can integrate into like your work regularly, right? Of like working with the students, staff, faculty you're serving, and in your personal life of reflecting on like, when I caused this harm, what was the impact regardless of what my intent was, and working with those who come into our offices, to learn how to express how harm impacted them. Mid-level practices are how we can respond to lower level harm. Their focus is on providing an immediate relationship focused response. So example, I guess, could be like if there's a roommate conflict, having like a quick facilitated discussion to address that. That might not necessarily be what we're doing in like our advocacy roles, but if you work in like another department at the university, you make these goals that are small, agreed upon repairs that help to preserve the community trust and prevent the conflict from escalating. So that falls in the 80%. The other 20% of the restorative justice spectrum are those formal and responsive practices for significant harm. And so this is normally what people think about when we talk about restorative justice practices. They're structured, they are typically a little higher stakes, they're addressing more serious misconduct, and they do require specialized training. So mediation training, there are a lot of cities and bigger cities especially have centers that are working on implementing restorative justice practices and having spaces for that with trained mediators. So that could be a place where that certification could happen. So I'm gonna explain a couple of the two main practices in this space. So restorative conferencing and victim offender dialogues. So victim offender dialogues focus on direct and facilitated talks between the victim and the offender to address the harm caused. It has to be initiated by the victim, and then there's extensive preparation to meet in this safe and facilitated setting, and the person harmed is given the space to ask questions, express the crime's impact, and then seek answers for if they would like to know the intention or where they would like the situation to go. The process seeks to help victims feel heard and gain understanding, and it helps to promote offender accountability as a goal anyway. It's voluntary and it's not focused on forgiveness or reconciliation. It's focused on healing and closure for the victim. So back to that victim-centered approach. Restorative conferencing is also a mediated dialogue, but it includes the harmed individuals as well as the person causing the harm, and then the harmed individual's family, support people, community. So it's a structured meeting where you're figuring out how do we repair the harm with that support and accountability structure. So all invited participants sit in a circle facing each other. It's typically a long process as well. During the conference, all parties have the opportunity to share how the person who caused the harm's actions affected not just the person harmed, but like everyone in their circle. Share perspectives and impact, and then what they would like to see happen as a result. And then the group together identifies actions required to repair the harm that's been done. So the role of the person harmed is to share the impact of the harm and their needs for repair and moving forward. They are not responsible for developing a plan or facilitating the dialogue. And the role of the person who caused harm is to take full responsibility at the end of this like circle conference, listen to the impact, and then be the primary party responsible for carrying out actionable specific repair plan. So direct amends is a big piece here. The conference will usually conclude with like a written agreement that outlines specific actions the offender will take. So like I said, restorative justice is not IR, kind of distilled that in this little graphic here. But restorative justice is philosophy, a specialized facilitation process. Informal resolution is more of an administrative procedure for resolving a complaint. Informal resolution can be limited by policy, or it is honestly, but limited by policy, focus on solutions to resolve the complaint. With restorative justice, you can be really creative. Asks are kind of wide open because it is a collaborative plan you're making together. And it's not like within an administrative or institutional setting. The goal for restorative justice is direct amends. So healing, actionable plan to make things right. With the informal resolution, it's policy adherence, so institutional sanctions, still hoping for a resolution, obviously, still like seeking that, but within the boundaries of the setting you're in. So IR was not designed to address deep relational harm that's caused in these situations, but that is the core of restorative practices. So again, with this little tangent, why would we spend so much time talking about restorative justice when it's not the administrative informal resolution process? I think it's helpful to discuss it because we can learn and adapt some of the principles and questions that are embedded in restorative practices to encourage accountability and dialogue. So a big piece of restorative justice is accountability. So shifting the focus to impact over intent. So in an informal resolution application, what would it look like in facilitating dialogue, guiding the person who caused the harm to focus on what the impact was rather than just the intent? So who was affected and what do you need to do to fix this? There's also a big piece of restorative justice is action, so collaborative repair. So rather than following predetermined punitive sanctions, trying to ask, like we do need to ask the complainant and the person harmed what is needed to make things right. But then also if we're asking the person who caused the harm, what is needed to make things right? That collaborative process can help with buy-in kind of just like, how do I actually take accountability for this harm that I caused and the impact that was there? And so this is obviously dreaming, right? So if we allow ourselves to dream and imagine these systems without the barriers in place, what would a restorative system focused on healing achieve? So moving away from a punitive focus that leaves everyone defensive. So, right now, I know Vanderbilt is lots of lawyers, lots of legal stuff, especially in many higher ed settings. So if students are worried about like legal action or being sued even after a resolution, how restorative of a process can it be? So that's, again, big picture dreaming question of culturally, what would it look like to shift? Another thing would be like reintegration for the person who caused harm. So if we could implement restorative groups for those who caused harm, safe spaces to emphasize accountability, understanding impact, and educating them on healthier choices, and could help in terms of like reintegrating them and creating trust in the community again. Restorative justice argues that reintegration piece is crucial to lower recidivism and reoffending, both in the context of the university and then outside of it. So the dream would be to implement restorative practices to create a fundamental shift in culture, to make communities safer, rather than just resolving an individual complaint that might continue over and over again, repeating in a cycle. So that's kind of the time to take out for restorative justice.
Just want to address one thing in the chat. So someone said that, oh goodness, I just lost all my screens. That on their campus, it doesn't usually feel like the survivor has enough power in the conversation to say, I will not accept any asks from you. Thank you so much for adding this in, because yes, absolutely. We are speaking from the perspective of at Vanderbilt, what things are like. And there is a lot of freedom for institutions to do this in different ways. I think that something that can be important to remember is there's a lot of power by being the person who's willing to say, okay, then we can go back to a formal process. If the complainant is okay with that, because that's a way that if the respondent is trying to push, no, you also have to do this. How can you don't get to say that you're not going to agree to anything. If the response to that is, okay, then I'm fine with us doing a formal process. It's in the respondent's interest to stick in the informal resolution. And so that can be a helpful tool to kind of wield, in that moment of like, okay, then I'm fine with us going through this whole thing, where if the respondent is facing potential expulsion, or if they could just agree to those 2 extra hours of consent education, when they're reminded of that, that can be a helpful moment to do so. So I just want to throw that in there. Now, I don't know what the factors are on your campus that make it that way. So this might not help address those factors, but just in general, I think that it is a helpful one. And I also just wanted to say one other thing about restorative justice as well, and how managing expectations comes into play there, where if someone in, your first conversation about informal resolution, if they're saying, my non-negotiable is that they have to acknowledge what they did. They have to acknowledge what they did, acknowledge that they harmed me, take responsibility for it. So as we've talked about, are people going to be willing to do that in the litigious environment that we are in? Maybe not. So in that instance, it might be managing expectations to say, okay, let's look if there is that restorative justice option somewhere. We have referred students to an organization here in Nashville that facilitates restorative justice circles and conversations. And we've had students pursue that instead, where they totally dropped all Title IX, everything, and they did that instead. So if that is a resource that is in your area, or if there are ones online, that's another way that you can help to manage those expectations and still help the person to get the goals that they are looking for.
Thanks, Olivia. So we're gonna kind of start to get into the activity, get y'all engaged in the chat a little bit more. So we've created this really helpful tool that you can find in the handout section underneath the program description in the app. So you can go ahead and click on that. This first page is just like a kind of example of how to use it, and then there's a blank copy for your purposes. We kind of created this tool because I think it can be really helpful to put pen to paper and think through what your options are. So we created it within that same frameworks that we had created of justice, safety, and education. So their goals are those I want to statements. I want to make sure they face consequences. I want to protect myself from this person. And then they can make their list of asks on the other side. It's pretty intuitive. You all are super smart, so I feel capable in your ability to use it. But it can be nice to have your options written down somewhere, so that, if you don't get your first 2 choices in the negotiation kind of setting, it can be good to know what your 3rd or 4th option is. I also think this is a really great way to engage folks in the process, helping them to, really be an active participant instead of it just feeling like you're the one who's giving them asks, and they can kind of think through them themselves. So we are going to do some scenarios, and then I would love for you all to respond in the chat with some options. So scenario number one says, a female student is going to be doing an informal resolution with a male student who groped her butt at a party. The student shares with you that they were friends prior to this incident and chose to do an IR because they did not want to get my friend in trouble, even if he hurt me. The student shares that she felt like her friend has issues with alcohol consumption and didn't really understand that he did something wrong. The student shares that her goals are to make sure this doesn't happen to someone else and to make sure he knows this isn't an okay thing to do. What are some potential asks that you could suggest?
And this can be things that you've heard us mention throughout the program. If you have something new, we would love to hear that too, things that
Yeah.
you've seen work, or just anything that you can come up with. Alcohol and consent education, yes, love that. Basics, consent education modules and in person, yeah. Some sort of impact statement with the respondent. I think, yeah, especially if we're looking at that, make sure he knows this isn't an okay thing to do. How do people know that that wasn't okay? By understanding the impact that their actions had on others. So I think that's a great one to address that specific goal.
Yeah. That's a great question.
Yeah.
What would help you feel that he has recognized something was wrong? Like, what would it mean for him to acknowledge his actions or to take accountability? Those are great questions. Yeah.
If the event was organizational, affiliated, or was at a campus shared space, what does attendance look like in the future? Yeah, that's a huge one. And one of our scenarios, I think, will address that a little bit. But that is a huge one. Things can get really complicated when it comes to student organizations, when it comes to, no, this is an official event from the university. It's not a private party where someone gets to choose the invitees and who's not allowed to come. Things can get really difficult there. So getting detailed in that agreement of if it's agreeing to sharing common spaces or attendance at the events for the club, getting specific with that is helpful. And also maybe having a plan for revisiting it, right? Like, okay, we're agreeing to this, but we also are going to understand that we might need to reassess at some point. So depending on your Title IX office and all of those things, if you can add in and I'd like to check in about this in 3 months to see how it goes. Or that's going to work out for this year. And then next year, I would like for us to revisit and kind of see what needs to change based off of our class schedules being different, based off of XYZ.
Perfect. If we want to head into scenario two, a male student plans to do an informal resolution with their ex-boyfriend who is physically violent at the end of their relationship. The student shares that they are choosing IR because they felt like they like that it's a non-punitive option. The ex has apologized, but the student feels they were trying to placate them so they did not get in trouble at the university. They share that their goals are to help their ex understand how they were impacted by the abuse. What are some asks that would meet their goal of justice?
Anyone have ideas? Throw them in the chat if so. Yeah, so we've got victim impact statement, maybe a mediated conversation if they're comfortable with that. I love that idea, because they've really identified the fact of, yeah, an apology has happened, but I didn't feel like it was sincere. So what are some ways in which we could ensure that the person is hearing how the harm, that the harm was legitimate, that an actual apology is needed, a mediated conversation is a great way to do that. I think that focusing on who the right person would be to mediate that conversation is really important. But I love that. Anger management, counseling for education, not necessarily for justice, victim impact, and requested written apology that actually outlines how their actions hurt the survivor. Yeah, like if they're saying, I definitely want an apology, and I know we've already talked about the asterisks with that of if someone is going to be willing to or not. But sometimes situations like this where there is more of a history between the two parties, so this situation, they were in a relationship. Sometimes there is a bit more trust with one person saying, no, I'm not looking to get you arrested. I'm not looking to get you in trouble. So sometimes an apology can be a more feasible thing that something will agree to because there is more of that history to go off of as opposed to just hoping that the other person means it when they say that they're not going to sue you. I personally screen with risk assessment and history of violence to see if the violence might even be falling under the skip step for Title IX proceedings. Yeah, so yes, absolutely. Like that's a huge piece of this. Of if the Title IX office is hearing the same student being named as a respondent over and over again, then that becomes a whole different thing, right? Where there is like a responsibility to address that. And so that it could be that this is a scenario where maybe it's not appropriate for informal resolution. So that's definitely important to keep in mind too. Go through scenario 3.
A female student is working with you due to being coerced into choking during a sexual encounter. The student recently found out that the other party filmed the encounter and is sharing the videos with members of their intramural ultimate frisbee team. The student shared she wants education about choking for him and education for the entire intramural team about sharing explicit photos and videos without consent. She would also like him barred from the team going forward. How would you help manage the student's expectations through this process?
So a little different of an ask to all of you for ideas in the chat. So we've got education for him, but realizing the entire team will likely not be possible. However, it could be included in a Title IX training for all athletes at annual training. Love that. Yes. So something to keep in mind is that this informal resolution process is with that other student, not with the entire team. So we can't make asks to mandate the entire team do something. I love this idea of having it kind of be a separate thing. Like, okay, the informal process, we're going to get, the respondent to agree to something. And then we're also going to separately approach the Title IX team or whoever does trainings like that, where let's get all intramural sports teams to take a training like this. I love that idea. Barring from may not be realistic. Yes, so that is part of the conversation that you would have to have. And helping them to understand that. And are you okay with that as a potential, and if no, then do we need to seek out a formal process as opposed to this one? So those are the things that can really get down to not only helping them to manage their expectations within the process, but manage their expectations of if this is the right process or not. And it might not be, and we definitely have students who go into this process and are halfway through an agreement, and then they're kind of like, wait, no, I changed my mind. I want to go back to the other one. And that's totally fine. Here at Vanderbilt, you have up until you actually sign the agreement to change your mind. So you could go through the entire thing, come up with a list of asks that the other party has agreed to. And then in that moment, as they're being asked to sign, if their gut is telling them like, no, this doesn't feel right, then that's fine. And they can change their mind then too. I would validate these asks that they make total sense, but make sure she understands the respondent would have to agree to the asks. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So
Meredith, I think your question is really interesting. If them leaving the team would be an IR option, or if that would be considered punitive. Um, we have seen people make the ultimate ask, or like, the like to separate from the university or to separate from an activity and say yes. That was specifically in the situation of an employee leaving the university. So a little bit different. But it is possible, but as everybody's talked about in the chat, probably not super likely that they're gonna agree to that. Mm.
And as difficult as these conversations can be, the managing expectations piece of it, in my experience, ultimately, it is students, once they kind of understand, they really understand why it is that you are bringing it up. And they, even if at first, if they're maybe like a little annoyed, at like, no, just let me do what I want, and it's not that we're not letting them do what they want, but when they can understand like, oh, I'm so glad you told me about that. I'm so glad you gave me a heads up. So as hard as those conversations can be, they're super important. Yeah. So that's what I know we only have 1 minute left. If there are any lingering questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat, or you can reach out to any of us. Our contact information is right here. But thank you all so much for your participation today. It was lovely to get to chat with you all.